The Minnesota Wild kicked off the week before the NHL Trade Deadline by acquiring Gustav Nyquist. The Winnipeg Jets are looking to add, as are the Detroit Red Wings after they fell in the Stadium Series. We've got all of that and a lot more coming up on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Gil Martin here, and welcome everybody to the Locked On NHL podcast Monday edition. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts so you get new episodes as soon as they drop. Great to welcome back to the show a familiar face and voice to Locked On NHL fans, Seth Toupal of Locked On Wild. And Seth, the Wild got out in front of everybody in the week before the trade deadline. Gustav Nyquist added to the mix. What does he provide, and how did he look in his Wild debut on Sunday?
Well, the interesting thing, Gil, is I think as interesting as the Nyquist acquisition was, some of Bill Guerin's comments were almost as interesting. I'll get to those in a little bit, but as far as Gustav Nyquist goes, I think what he represents is a known commodity. Now, if you look at the year that he was having this year, obviously not as successful as he had with Nashville last year. Pretty much a career high across the board, not in the goals department, but in the points department. He had a fantastic season for the Predators. Not having as great of a season this year, but get in line. Who on Nashville is actually having a good year? He represents somebody that can slot into a top six role for this Minnesota Wild team and actually play that role. Is actually somebody that is a top six player. I have been almost mystified by the fact that a recent waiver wire pickup, Vinny Hinostroza, has played his way in just a short time, played his way into, top 6 minutes, number one spot on the power play. I know people are out, but there just are so many players that it seems like are underperforming and are playing above where they normally slot in the lineup, that this represents an opportunity for Bill Guerin to go get somebody that he can essentially plug and play. You know that Nyquist is going to give you some solid offensive upside. He's pretty smart with the puck. He is great on the penalty kill as well, which is a dire need for the Minnesota Wild, but his addition will fill up a top six spot and will prevent somebody else in that lineup having to stretch to that spot and kind of play out of position too.
How did he look in his debut on Sunday afternoon?
He looked fine. I mean, he was helping push the puck up the ice. He contributed to a penalty kill that was perfect against the Boston Bruins. So not a bad debut for Nyquist, and he played on the top line with Matt Boldy and Marco Rossi. So just step right in. He said it was good to be back, and I'm looking forward to seeing how the next game goes.
Now, you mentioned the comments by Bill Guerin. What did he say, and what are you taking from it?
Well, this is interesting because you would think that if you didn't have really any idea on a timetable for particular players, that it might behoove you to put them on long-term injured reserve and utilize that cap space. Bill Guerin is not sure when Kirill Kaprizov or Joel Eriksson Ek are going to be back, but the thing that he is adamant about is that he thinks they will be back before the regular season is done. So basically, we're just in kind of a holding pattern. So as far as acquisitions go, this might be it for the Minnesota Wild. But, I was looking the other day when Joel Eriksson Ek got hurt, and I had heard one of the timetables was potentially 6 to 8 weeks. 6 weeks puts you in the middle of April, which is basically the end of the regular season. So if that's the short term, it probably would behoove you to utilize that money and go the route that so many other teams have gone, where then once the postseason starts, you say, oh, hey, turns out he's okay. Turns out Kirill Kaprizov is just healed up magically and able to get back out on the ice and help this team. But for whatever reason, it seems like the Wild aren't going to do that. And the latest update we had on Kirill Kaprizov was that he's going to be out longer than expected, whatever that means. I'm getting kind of frustrated by the just level of mysticism around something that a doctor tells you after a procedure is done. Hey, you're going to be out 4 to 6 weeks. Okay, we think this player is going to be out 4 to 6 weeks. We'll reevaluate at that point. But instead, all we get is, well, it is an injury, and it's going to be at some point between now and the end of the regular season. Like, there just is a lot of vagueness, and I kind of feel I'm going to be fascinated to see how this plays out, because if they don't come back, if Kirill Kaprizov and Joel Eriksson don't come back before the regular season is done, this is going to feel like a really missed opportunity.
They can go on LTIR and come off before the season ends. I mean, you have to miss 10 games minimum, and what is it, 23 days or something like that? I mean, there are cap ramifications depending on who else may or may not be added. Why the hesitation to save a little cap space and to put these players on LTIR, even if they are coming back before the season ends?
Well, that's the thing that Bill Guerin has been so adamant about. And Kirill Kaprizov, actually looking at Puckpedia, is actually already on long-term injured reserve, but he's been adamant about, well, we're not going to use that cap space because we anticipate that he'll be back before the end of the regular season. Well, you've got like 20 games. So when is that going to be? Is that going to be a week from now? Is it going to be 2 weeks from now? Is that going to be at the end of March? Like, what is the timetable? I think a lot of people just kind of get frustrated by well, he'll come back when he's ready. Like, it's not that you don't go to the doctor and have a procedure done, and the doctor says, well, I'll call you when you're good to go. That's not how that process works. Like, they tell you, okay, it's going to be this amount of time, and then you can maybe do this. Maybe you could do this. Like, it feels like, it kind of, to me, feels like there is a possibility that these guys don't return, and that we're getting a little bit of bet hedging here to, well, we hope they come back, to then all of a sudden have it turn around at the end of the season like, well, we thought they were going to come back, but they didn't. Well, what do you want us to do?
Do we maybe learn more about the timetable at the trade deadline based on what Bill Guerin does or does not do?
I would hope so, because this whole thing with Kaprizov started the game after Christmas, when it was, hey, we're going to hold him out. He's a little banged up, is what fans were told. He's a little banged up. We're going to hold him out just to make sure that he's right. And then all of a sudden it's, well, he's going to need surgery. He's going to miss probably at least 4 weeks. And then all of a sudden now he's going to miss longer than we expected. Like, what? When can we expect for him to come back? That's all I want to know.
If the Wild make another move, what do you think they're looking for?
Well, I think either penalty kill help or another top 6 forward, I think, are probably the two biggest items on the agenda. And it'll be interesting to see too, because now Jonas Brodin got hurt a game ago, And it sounds like he might be out for, well, actually, I think it was announced that he's going to be week to week, whatever that means. So I would say penalty kill help, which would likely be a forward or a center. And, maybe another top 6 would probably be on the wish list. Obviously, there are all the Brock Nelson links, but that seems like that's less and less likely. The interesting one is going to be Vancouver. Does Brock Besser decide that he wants out of a ship that seems like it's starting to take on some water? That's going to be the one to watch, I think.
Going to be fascinating to see how this plays out and whether we get any more information out of Bill Guerin. Seth, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
You can find Locked on Wild on all of your favorite social media platforms at Locked on Wild. And you can also follow me on X at Seth, TOUPS, for all of your favorite Minnesota Wild notes, musings, and other Minnesota sports as well. We will continue to keep you up to date on all things Minnesota Wild here as we move down the stretch.
Seth, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Today's episode is brought to you by Wonderful Pistachios. Looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts. Each 1 ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats to help keep you feeling fuller longer. Personally, I love the no-shells variety. It's the perfect grab-and-go snack for busy days. Whether I'm snacking at my desk, on a road trip, or just need a quick protein boost, they're always my go-to. And if you love cracking open every shell for that satisfying crunch, the in-shell options are a classic favorite. So get snacking and get cracking with the snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. That's wonderfulpistachios.com. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, Harrison Lee. And, Harrison, if this wasn't the Jets, I don't even think I'd be asking this question. But the team wins 11 straight. They are now winless in their last 2, although they did get a point in their last game. Is this just sort of a natural letdown, or is there any concern about this little mini 2-game drought?
Winnipeg predictably is currently on fire, so I'm sure everyone has lost their minds. I think there are some interesting things about the way that they've played the last few games that have kind of been lingering issues for a while now, and maybe it's just the power play finally not scoring like 3 times every game. It might surface some things about how the team's constructed. I think the biggest thing, the Jets are still grappling with is that at 5v5, they're a good team. They're not amazing. And I think that's been a theme throughout the year. And, with Hellebuck and the power play, it's not really a big problem. But I think once you start getting into the postseason, one thought I've kind of had is the power play almost too good? We all know that NHL refs kind of like to game manage once you get to the playoffs. And so I've thought, well, if the Jets have a reputation of scoring once every 3 opportunities, are the refs going to be even more reticent to give them out? And so I'm kind of like, with that in mind, you better have a good 5v5 offense. And the Jets are kind of like 80% of the way there. It's just there's maybe 20% where I think in games like these, it does start to show a little bit. Like the Preds game, I don't really read too much into. It's second half of a back-to-back. Very funny that they're I think the only team that's beaten the Jets twice this year. And they've both been on the second half of back-to-backs. That must be like the pity award for the Preds. The NHL was like, here, you're going to have a really awful season. You get to play a tired Jets team twice, and that's your little banner for the season. But the Flyers loss, you kind of go, it is what it is. You would have liked a couple of, goal scoring opportunities to actually go in, but, I don't think anyone's too freaked out. I think it's just sort of a reiteration of, why this trade deadline is really, really crucial for this team.
I almost, again, feel embarrassed asking this, but, second in the league right now in goals scored, first in the league in goals against, as you alluded to, number one on the power play. The penalty kill is just average. It's 14th in the league. Any thoughts on needing to improve that, or is the team okay with the PK as it exists right now?
I think the PK won't improve until the personnel improves. And so, they like to be an aggressive unit. They like to attack the puck carrier, cut off space, and limit time for opposing structures to set up. But the problem is that they don't really have guys who are fast enough to disrupt those. And so I think, being middle of the road is kind of okay this year. I think one of the big things that really helps the Jets, and maybe what I sort of underestimated, is how bad everyone else is. I just look at the competition and I'm like, man, this is like the year of mid. If you have like an average team, you are feeling pretty good, because if you have a good trade deadline, you could be in one of the top end contender rankings. I mean, there's just not that many great teams out there. So I think you're allowed a few more, I guess you can call them concessions, or maybe some sins than you'd typically be allowed in other seasons. I think the PK worries me less than the 5v5 stuff, but it's not great. So pending how they approach this trade deadline, they could kind of address some of it, but I don't think it's ever going to be better than like 12th or 10th. I think at this point, it is kind of what it is.
What are the biggest concerns for this team heading into the trade deadline?
Well, I think the market prices so far have been a little quirky. Gustav Nyquist for like a second rounder is not great. It's hard to say that the Jets are going to like break the vaults, but I do feel like if there was ever a year where Winnipeg is going to swing, it's going to be this year. And with the market kind of being a little hard to predict, I sort of wonder if the Jets get a bit spooked by prices and kind of back off this big swing. But I think they do recognize that this team needs a little bit of extra juice. I mean, they're close. They tick off a lot of the right boxes. The depth lines are fantastic. Your power play is top tier. Your goaltending is historically great. So you're not really too worried about a lot. But, one thing that I've kind of thought about is how do you hide the top line? The Jets' top line this year is better than it's been in previous years. But I feel like when you have Connor Scheifele and Velarde together, it's a very 50-50 unit. Either they're on or they're not. And when it comes to the playoffs, you need them to be on more of the time. And we just haven't seen that consistently this season. So I think Winnipeg really needs to kind of figure out a way to make your middle six a really strong unit. And with how the market started off, it's a little hard to guess how much they're willing to spend. But I hope that they are, maybe no sacred cows. I think everyone's going to have some sort of a price. So we'll just have to see how that sort of plays out.
Is there anybody in particular you think they'll be targeting?
Well, as an Islanders fan, you've heard at least one of them. Brock Nelson, I think, is probably up there on the list. Dobson, I think, probably holds some appeal too. But, that's going to be one of those break the bank kind of moments. And I don't know if the Jets want to go that route. I continue to kind of think one of two teams is my preferred choice, either Seattle or Utah. I think both teams have pieces that fit what the Jets need. Alexiak and McCann are huge ads. From Utah, I sort of wonder how much they love guys like Dirtsey and Schmaltz, maybe in that sort of tier, Barrett Hayton. There's guys out there that I think you can do reasonable packages for, but oftentimes the Jets sort of do this thing where they're like, well, we'll pretend we're really interested in Scott Lawton, but really we have this side deal that we're working on. So I kind of feel like that's maybe a direction they go. It wouldn't shock me if the market just absolutely tanks and everything's gone to crap, that Lawton and maybe Ristolainen become the additions by like there not being better options. But I think that would be like a worst case scenario for the Jets. Probably not what they're planning for.
What do you think they're looking to give up in exchange?
I think ideally, you're looking at Barlow and pick, and maybe a roster player as kind of being your starting package for a bigger player, a bigger name, maybe one with term. I think they're willing to add 4 or 5 pieces together. They don't really seem to want to touch Lambert. If Barlow's the name that's going out there, they view Lambert as pretty critical to the future. So I don't think Brad's really in the conversation. I haven't heard anything about Shiberkov being linked either. I did see something really funny. Apparently, Reshevsky was called one of the Jets' top prospects. I'm like, did they get the name wrong? Did they just confuse the 2 Russian wingers? But entirely possible. But I think for Winnipeg, they always like to operate on the budget with their trade packages. And last year was like a first and a second plus 1 or 2 odds and ends for Toffoli and Monahan, which, I mean, they were slow as heck, but they were good for the price, and so you couldn't really complain. I think this year they're going to have to do a little more. I think they've probably told Helly and Scheifele they're going to be more aggressive, and they keep saying that they're doing a lot of discussions and conversations. And so I think now the question just becomes, can they convince a couple of guys who are maybe on the bigger side to maybe waive some of their trade protections? If that's a thing that they can pull off, I think they'd have more ability to spend assets and really bring in somebody who's got maybe 2 to 3 years of term. I think that's probably an ideal spot for them up front. On the back end, I think they're probably looking more on the depth defender side.
Going to be interesting. I know this week will not be dull in Winnipeg or anywhere else for that matter. Harrison, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
We are at Locked On Winnipeg Jets, which is on YouTube and all of your favorite podcasting platforms. You can find me on social media at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets.
All right, Harrison, thank you so much.
Thanks. Have a good one.
It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the co-host of Locked On Red Wings, Brian Fisher. And Brian, pretty exciting game in Columbus, but not the outcome the Red Wings wanted, even though they thoroughly outshot the Columbus Blue Jackets. You were there. Talk to me about that game.
Yeah, it was the most exciting 1 minute of my life there in the third period when they tied it up 3-3, and I was like, yeah, overtime, and then controversy then followed that. Yeah, the game was, honestly, I thought the Red Wings played really, really well in that hockey game, and it was a perfect response from what they had on Thursday. They laid an egg at LCA on Thursday. They looked tired. They looked exhausted, and Blue Jackets looked energized. They were forechecking like crazy, and McClellan challenged the team to respond, and I thought they did in pretty much every single facet. Obviously the shot attempts is what's going to attract everyone's eye immediately. Detroit outshot them 46-21, but the actual the shot attempts, right? Your Corsi share at 5-on-5. 56-27 in favor of Detroit. It was a 71% expected goals for share for Detroit. In every single conceivable statistical category, Detroit should have won this hockey game, but they did not. And there's several factors for that. One of the main reasons being, that controversial call, right? Let's address that. That was a high stick, and it should have been called. That final goal with 2 minutes left that the Columbus Blue Jackets scored should not have counted. But to solely blame that loss, I mean, obviously that was the biggest reason. If there was a percentage of a pie chart, that'd be probably 66%. But the Red Wings were also, they gave up 4 goals on 20 shots. There's so much more to the story when you're looking at it like that. That's unacceptable, and it goes into a bigger problem that this team is having, where they have the offense, but right now, if their goaltending's not bailing them out, which is capable of doing it on some nights, but not consistently. Cam Talbot and Alex Lyon are a fine tandem, but they're probably around middle of the league at best. They're going to have off nights, and so if the goaltending's not bailing them out, they're going to allow 3 to 4 bad goals a night because they're simply too soft in their own zone. They're simply too soft in front of their own net.
How much of that is the defensemen themselves, and how much of that is the forwards not coming back to help out, or is it positioning? What's the root cause of this defensive breakdown?
All of it. Detroit's forward group is very offensive oriented, and Right now, they're hurting down the middle with Andrew Kopp done for the season. He's a very good two-way center. Now, I know a lot of Red Wings fans will scoff at me praising Andrew Kopp because his production isn't great, but there's no way you can deny the defensive acumen that he brings to the team as a center. He's one of your most, if not your most responsible defensive forwards you have on the team. So JT Compher's back there in the second line. He's filling it nicely, but Michael Rasmussen was out after taking a headshot from Jack Hughes against the Devils a couple weeks ago. So, I mean, about a week ago now. He should be coming back soon, but you're missing two centers down the middle, so the center depth's kind of thin. So you've had your lineups be a little bit out of sync because of that, although the second line provided all 3 goals in that game, DeBrincat with 2 goals and Patrick Kane with a goal and 3 points himself. But it affects everywhere down the lineup. And then in the defensive zone, I think you're seeing, as good as Albert Johansson and Simon Edvinsson have been in their rookie seasons, or it's basically a rookie season for Edvinsson, he's not technically a rookie, I think you're seeing the wear and tear of a full NHL season starting to affect that pair. The last week or so, maybe 2 weeks going back before the Four Nations break, it feels like in the defensive zone, they're starting to get outworked a little bit. And for a guy of Edvinsson's size, he needs to be able to use his body more successfully. I think to that power play goal the Red Wings allowed, the league worst penalty kill, second best power play, but league worst penalty kill for the Detroit Red Wings. That goal's prevented if Simon Edvinsson just simply lifts the stick. If he just lifts the stick of the forward out front, that goal doesn't happen. Justin Holl and Gustafsson, right? That's another big sore point, is that defensive pair. That third pair for Detroit is really tough. Really tough to watch, I should say. And McClellan clearly doesn't trust them because in crunch time, he won't deploy them. They play maybe 12 minutes a night on most nights. And you saw that in the third goal they allowed. 30 seconds after they scored the second and the go-ahead goal, Justin Holl and Gustafsson get confused, get mixed up behind the net. Cam Talbot's on the wrong post, and just a simple, just jam it home goal. Something completely preventable. So defensive depth is really mightily affecting this team, but I don't think the forwards necessarily help either, because a lot of your forwards, like I said, are very offensive oriented outside of the couple guys that I listed that are out of the lineup, and they don't necessarily do a whole lot in the offensive zone to help the defense with outlet passes. Just not really getting to their spots in time, not really successfully transitioning up the ice. And then if they do get the puck to the neutral zone, it's a lot of dump and chase. And a lot of times they're losing that race after dumping, so they turn the puck right back over. So very, very much glass cannon offense, right? You're going to score a lot of goals, but you might also give up a lot of goals. And it's just they got to get tougher in their own end. They got to be able to shut things down more consistently. So yeah, it's a little bit of everything in terms of the defense.
Right now, Detroit in the second wild card spot as we record this episode. The trade deadline is a few days away. What do you expect the Red Wings to be looking for, and what do you expect them to be willing to give up at the trade deadline?
So it's no secret that Detroit's not like a Stanley Cup contender, right? This is a team that's still trying to make a playoff berth after missing for, 8 straight seasons, something like along those lines. So this is a team, though, I think that is strongly out of selling phase. This is a team that wants to make the playoffs. So you're not going to be going out there and acquiring Seth Jones, right, who's already been acquired by the Florida Panthers. But just as an example, you weren't going to make that kind of deal, giving up a promising young goaltender and a first-round pick. You're not going to be giving up anything unless if you're going to get anyone with term, it's going to be somebody who's young and already has that term. Somebody that you don't mind giving up extra assets for because you know they're going to be here for a while. No rentals, nothing of that matter unless it's cheap. So I think you're going to be going after guys like Dylan Cousins, who maybe could use a change of scenery. There have been strong reports all season long about the Detroit Red Wings' pursuit of Dylan Cousins. He's 23, big body center, position of need, already locked up. The only bugaboo with that is his term, right? It's 7. He's got a 7-year deal. I think he's in year 2 of it at $7 million, and his production hasn't met that price mark. But we've seen a lot of people leave Buffalo and then have success elsewhere, and all of his other tools speak to that. That's in there still. So unless you're going out there and getting a young guy with term already, you're likely just going to be attacking depth forwards or depth defensemen, which is still a huge area of need. I just listed all about how the bottom 2 pairs on Detroit Red Wings defense is bad. Go out there and get a everyday third pair defenseman or an everyday third or fourth line winger who will help provide either depth scoring or better defense in your own zone. And that'll go a long ways. If you can have a third pair that you can trust to put out there, that'll go a long way into how it affects the deployments of these other two pairs. You won't be running those other two pairs into the ground because you're afraid of putting your third pair out there. You'll be able to give Edvinsson and Johansson a little bit of a rest here as the season begins to wear on them as they're in their first full NHL season. So really, I think that's probably the most likely thing, is acquiring depth pieces. I know the popular name around the league for forward was Trent Frederick, but now he's week to week with an injury, so I don't know what the situation there is. Defensively, I haven't really looked at defensive depth candidates that they could acquire, but if there is somebody out there that is available, I really think that a depth defenseman who will help solidify that bottom pair could be a huge area of need. Other than that, it's somebody young with term on a team that doesn't think it's going to work out.
And what are they willing to give up at this point?
They have an extra third-round pick. That's why I think that the depth is probably more likely. They have extra, later-round picks. They have a ton of prospects that aren't necessarily top of the line. Like, you have Antti Tuomisto, William Wallander, guys who have NHL ceilings but might not be huge impact players. They have a ton of guys under contract that, if you're selling to a team if you're trying to buy a player from a team that's selling, you could maybe guys like Joe Veleno. I like Michael Rasmussen personally, but even Michael Rasmussen, guys of that nature who are under term, under team control, in Veleno's case, you might be able to exchange that for a guy in a deal where you're trying to get somebody with term just to make the cap space work. But I mean, I'm just riffing here. They have a lot of prospects. They have a lot of late round picks, but I don't think we're in a position yet to trade away a first round pick or trade away a top-tier prospect because the team's just not in win now mode. They're in make the playoffs and have this team take that step forward mode.
All right. Well, it's going to be an interesting week. I know you'll have it covered every step of the way. Brian, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you and your co-host on social media?
Yeah, you can find me over at Locked On Red Wings, at Brian Fisher, LORW, on both Blue Sky and Twitter. Scotty is at Bentley Scotty on both platforms as well. And we are at LO_Red Wings on Twitter and at LO Red Wings on Blue Sky because they don't allow underscores in their ats. So that's where you can find us. And, of course, anywhere you listen to your podcasts.
All right. Brian, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. For your next listen, check out Locked On Fantasy Hockey. Become a fantasy hockey expert and get the edge over your league mates with daily tips from our hosts, Steele and Flip. Check out Locked On Fantasy Hockey wherever you get podcasts. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank my guest, Brian Fisher of Locked On Red Wings, Harrison Lee of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, and Seth Toupal of Locked On Minnesota Wild for joining me today. I'm Gil Martin. I host the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, and I co-host the Friday edition along with Rachel Donner. Don't forget, we're here every day, Monday through Friday, bringing you the biggest stories from around the NHL. And then Saturday, we have our Women's Hockey Spotlight with Erica L. Ayala and Rachel Donner. So join us for that as well. Have a great day, everybody. Stay safe, and thanks for listening to and watching the Locked On NHL podcast.